So today, what we're going to talk about, this is Unit 8, and we're going to talk about, I have the title of the unit, Looking Behind the Veil, and I don't know whether that's going to be the long-term title, but what we're going to be talking about is visitation and visions, NDEs, and SDEs, and we'll describe all those things, define all those things in a minute. So far, we've really started at some fundamental things. I'm not going to go through them all right now, but we're worked our way up to mediumship, I think is the last thing we talked about. And the point of this unit is to really talk about direct experiences, visual experiences and auditory experiences with, let's call it the non-physical, without any intermediaries. As I said, last time we talked about psychics and mediums, and that's really a situation where you've got an intermediary involved and you're really passing information through. This is where we start talking about more direct experiences. Okay? So let's just start with visitation and visions. So the idea here is, hopefully you're getting the point that where we're really at so far is that we've really determined that there's a whole aspect of our world that's unseen to us. And I just refer to that as the non-physical. There's so many other words that you can use, but that's the word that I've chosen. I think it's pretty descriptive, and it's pretty bland in terms of sort of religious connotation, etc. But I'm just going to continue to refer to it as the non-physical. But so not only is there sort of a non-physical aspect to our world, I think what we got into in the last units, it was that there are entities that exist in that environment, in that realm, you might call it. You might call it a dimension. There are entities that exist there. And when we were talking about mediums, those entities were really individuals who have passed over, individuals that have died. And so we're going to take that a little bit further in this unit, and we're going to talk about individuals who have died who may end up having some sort of more direct contact with people. I mentioned a story in one of the early units, and I forget which unit it was, but it was about my aunt who was about to die of cancer, and she saw a man standing in the corner. And anyone who has really spent any time studying or learning about spirituality, mysticism, any of these things, would realize that that happens. First of all, it happens a lot. But second of all, it's literally a person who has died, who has come, who is going to help this about to deceased person transition to, I'll just call it the non-physical. And so very often the way these stories are told, as I said in the previous unit, is that these people are loved ones, friends, associates of the person who is dying. Apparently that was not the case with my aunt. This person was apparently, she didn't recognize this man. That doesn't mean to say he wasn't family. It just means to say that she didn't recognize whoever this person was. So that's an example of a visitation. And so I'd like to give you another example from my own life, just to sort of illustrate the kinds of things we're talking about. And the other thing I would just generally say is this unit is mostly about stories. It's mostly about giving you examples of these sorts of things. And you can go online and find many, dozens, hundreds, thousands probably, of examples of stories if you wish. I've just decided to pick a few that I think are interesting and illustrate the point. So let's get into it. My mother-in-law, several years ago, passed away after a long illness with cancer. A cancer in her sinuses, and so not only did she lose a lot of weight during this process, but she was disfigured in the process as well. And so when the funeral arrangements were made, it was decided that we would have a closed casket, and for those reasons. My wife and her sister were very involved in the planning for the funeral. My father-in-law, for understandable reasons, just wanted that to be taken care of. And so my wife and her sister really stepped up to handle that. Without getting into all the details, obviously when making funeral arrangements for someone, you need to think about things like clothes and whatnot, because this was going to be a traditional interment where, there would be a casket and all of that. It would not be an open casket, but still decisions had to be made about dress and those sorts of things. This all kind of took place over the course of a few days. We went to central New York, which is where my father-in-law and mother-in-law lived. And we went up there, and my wife and my wife's sister made those arrangements when we were there. And it was done over the course of a few days. And then we had the funeral, the wake, all those different steps in the process. It was sort of traditional that way. But so when my wife and sister went up, none of these decisions and choices had been made, and they kind of went through their mother's things and chose some articles of clothing and some jewelry and those sorts of things, and made those choices while they were up there. Various other brothers and sisters needed to come and meet us there as well, and one of them, my sister-in-law, wasn't able to get there until actually the morning of the ceremony with her daughter. So she wasn't there during these first few days when all these plans were being made, nor was she really consulted because, she's a daughter-in-law and not a daughter. So the daughters kind of took the reins and ran with it, so to speak. So anyways, we went through this whole process, and I believe it was on a Saturday. I'm just going to say it was a Saturday. It doesn't really matter what day of the week it was. The day rolled around to have the ceremonies. Literally, we were in the church, I believe, when my sister-in-law arrived with her daughter. We were actually sitting in the pew at the church at the ceremony, and my sister-in-law arrived. And her and her daughter sat right behind myself and my wife. And we were sort of going through the whole ceremony, and every couple of times during the ceremony, there was just a little bit of activity behind us. Whispering, talking, movement, whatever. I didn't pay much attention to it. I didn't really care. It wasn't that distracting, but there was something sort of going on. So we did the whole thing at the cemetery. We were all done, and then we went back, as these things usually happen. There's a reception. We went back to the house and had the reception. And we ended up having a conversation with my sister-in-law and my niece. And what they told us was rather interesting. My niece informed us that her grandmother, which of course was the woman that we were having the funeral for, came and sat beside her and was talking to her and conveying the sort of standard messages that you hear in stories like this, that she loved her and that she would be going away, but that she was fine and everything will be fine, etc., etc. And so I had this whole conversation during the ceremony, which is pretty incredible. My wife then asked what her grandmother was wearing, and the girl proceeded to tell my wife exactly the dress that was picked out for her, which none of us, as far as I know, had ever even seen before. I think it was a green dress with some sort of white collar on it or something along those lines, and a set of pearls. And as far as I know, my niece, nor really any of us, had seen that dress before because she hadn't worn it in many, many years. And as I said, my sister-in-law and my niece, neither of the two had any idea how my wife and her sister had their mother dressed. So it was pretty extraordinary to not only hear someone say, Grandma came and sat down beside me and talked to me, but what was especially veridical about this story was the fact that she precisely described the dress that her grandmother was wearing and the fact that she was wearing the pearl necklace. So there you go. You hear stories very often. Usually these are stories that come from mediums or books that were written through a channeling kind of a process, and we'll be talking about that in a future unit. But you definitely hear of stories told by people who have died through mediums or channels, and they often talk about the fact that they attend their own funeral and that they're there to witness it and to comfort the people that are there, or to see the people that are there, or for whatever it is that they do. So this is not unusual at all in terms of the fact that my mother-in-law would have been there for her own funeral, given that seems to be a pretty standard thing to have happen. But this was a great way for us to hear something evidential about it having happened. Lots of families have stories like this in them, about, very similar to this. And, very often people hear those stories and dismiss them, and they just kind of chalk them up to, overactive imaginations, etc. Pardon me while I try to adjust this camera. I really, honestly, before I started looking into these things in detail, that's pretty much what I would have done as well. I would have assumed that it was something that was made up, and I would have probably invented lots of rationales to justify my opinion. I've since stopped doing that, and I've tried to take these things more on face value. And so there you are. I wouldn't be surprised if you have a similar story in your family, but that's one from mine. Those are the kinds of things that I would call visitations or visions. There's lots and lots of examples of people seeing ghosts, seeing, apparitions, seeing balls of light, other kinds of visual sorts of things, auditory sorts of visitations. Lots of examples about, I was about to get on that plane and there was a voice in my right ear that said, don't get on the plane. Or I was driving down the road and of course, and then the plane ends up crashing. Or I was driving down the road and a voice hollered at me to stop immediately. And I did. And then all of a sudden, a truck, jackknife it right in front of me. Whatever. There's a myriad of different types of stories and so, that have messages, either visual or auditory messages, that where someone who had died intervened in some way. These are not that unusual, and the web is full of these things, and I will put some links to a few of these things in the reference section of this material so that you can look into it if you'd like. So let's move on here and talk about NDEs. This is one of the most, in terms of the volume of stories, the volume of evidence, near-death experiences are one of the highest volume. I just want to spend a minute or so talking about what an NDE is and talking about death in general. It's important because every time the discussion comes on an NDE type of discussion comes up, there always ends up being a long discussion about what is death, and had the person really died, right? Is what it always boils down to. The fact of the matter is, if you spend a little time looking at it, you'll find that the definition of death changes. And it seems to change as our technology to extend life improves. So really, the definition of death 100 years ago really involved pain stimulus, poke the person with a pin and see if they respond, palpable heart rhythm, just see if you can palpate for a heart rhythm, either here or on the wrist. The old mirror under the nose to see if there's any inhalations and exhalations that would fog a mirror, right? No, that's pretty much what people did 100 years ago. And as our technologies improved, and as now we have CPR and other kinds of interventions, we have to be more and more careful about how death is declared. And so now there is brain wave monitors that we can put on there, and EKG, so we can do EKG. So in other words, we can look at heart activity, we can look at brain activity. At one point we would look at heart activity until we get a flat line, quote flat line, which means you have no heart rhythm anymore. But then it was determined that maybe that wasn't the best approach, because even after the heart stops, the brain can survive for some period just using the residual oxygenated blood that's still in the brain. And so, perhaps someone's heart could stop and then you could start CPR and bring them back. And so maybe they weren't dead after all, right? So on and on and on it goes. As our ability to bring people back from these critical states, as that improves, our definition of death also evolves, right? And even to this time, there is no absolute definition of death. You'll actually find that it differs from state to state. There is no one comprehensive way to determine whether someone has died. Having said all that, we need to just acknowledge that if someone isn't breathing, if someone doesn't have a heartbeat, and if someone doesn't have any brainwave function, in most states, in most situations, they would be considered dead. Is it possible that having reached that state, that it's reversible and that they could resume their life? Yes, it is possible, and it has happened. And so, again, the skeptic could say, well, if you brought them back to life, then they weren't really dead. Well, that is just an overly simplistic and honestly unfair assertion, because how long do you need to wait to see if they come back to life? If you wait 10 minutes and they don't come back, will you admit that they're dead? Will you concede that point? Well, what happens if they spontaneously revived at 11 minutes? Well, now are you going to wait 20 minutes, an hour, 2 days? What if the person who had died in cold water? Cold water death is a very, very special situation where someone could be immersed in cold water for an hour without being able to breathe and still be, because of the low temperatures, because that preserves the decay in the brain and other tissues, that someone could come back to life. So it's really honestly just unfair for someone to say, see, they came back to life, therefore they weren't really dead. Because if you want to take that logic, then you would have to stand there and wait for an indeterminate amount of time, years, I suppose, until the body actually decayed, for someone to finally concede that, okay, I will concede that they're dead. All right, so people who use that argument, it's just overly simplistic and not a reasonable argument to use. All right, so I'm just going to having said that, let's get back to the point at hand. There's lots and lots of examples of people who have died. And by the way, even for the skeptic who says they weren't really dead, I think that doesn't change the fact that these stories that I'm going to tell you are pretty amazing. Okay, so let's just say that as well. So there's some common threads that could run through almost all of these stories, and most people will recognize them. There's the whole floating above the body. I floated above my body. I saw the doctors. I saw what they were doing. I could hear what they were doing. I saw the doctors in the operating room doing certain things. There's lots and lots of cases where people recognize just odd tools and odd procedures that they tell the doctors about after they were revived. And it turns out that they were correct. They really did use those odd tools and odd procedures. Strange things that were said, turns out they were actually said. By the way, remember this patient, their eyes are usually taped over. There's something draped over their head, right? So even if they were awake, they couldn't see any of these things. But in many, many, many cases, people have decided to describe the drills or other kinds of tools that were being used on them during their procedure. Most of these sort of situations happen in operating rooms and emergency rooms. And even before I get to a couple of these stories, there's lots of stories where patients have described the entire procedure that was used to revive them accurately. And the skeptic would say, well, you know what? Anyone who's watched ER or any of these other, emergency medical shows on TV would have already a picture in their mind of what these procedures are, and they would be able to spout those procedures just from memory. Well, it turns out there have been studies where they took people who have had NDEs, and they took people who have not had NDEs, but were in these emergency room situations, and they asked both of those groups what happened to them when they were out. And so the people who did not have an NDE described what they imagined would have been done to them during their procedure. And the people who did have the NDE described what they actually witnessed as having happened, right? And so you have two groups of people. The group that did not have an NDE that described what they think probably happened, and then you had the people who did have an NDE who described what actually they witnessed. And what they found was the people who actually witnessed it were correct in, I'm going to sort of make up some numbers here, but I'm not far off, I promise you. Something like 90% of the information that came from the people who had NDEs was accurate. Something like 50% of the information that came from the people who did not have an NDE were accurate. So what we see is a huge difference in the accuracy between the people who guessed what happened and the people who claim they actually saw what happened. So how do you explain that? Well, the only way to explain it is the people who did have the NDE did have an experience, a valid experience that included information that's verifiable. All right? So let's just talk about a couple of these stories. And these are very well-known stories that you can Google find very easily. One is the Anita Morjani story. This is a woman who had an awful type of cancer, which had tumors, large tumors the size of lemons throughout her neck, down across her chest, and down into her abdomen. She was in very, very late stages in a hospital in Hong Kong. It was really at the point where her organs were shutting down and she was getting ready to die. At this point, I think she weighed like 80 pounds or something. And was in just awful physical condition, which, as I said, you can kind of picture from what I've just described that it wasn't pretty. She said at one point, though, so she went into a coma. And at that point, the doctors were, really preparing her family for the fact that she was about to die and probably not going to make it through the night. And the doctors explained that her organs had already shut down, and given that, she had a very short time to live. Interestingly enough, what Anita found, that is, when she went into her coma, is that she sort of floated outside her body, and she could perceive the people around her, the fact that her husband was sitting there holding her hand, the fact that the doctor was suctioning, fluid out of her lungs and doing different things, different procedures. She could see all these things. She could hear all these things. But she found it actually went, so that's a sort of a typical, near-death experience or out-of-body experience kind of description of the situation. But she also found that she could actually, whatever she concentrated on, and wherever that was that she was concentrating on it, that she would be aware of what was going on at that location. So, for example, she was there in her room, hovering above her body, watching what was going on, and she perceived a conversation that was going on down the hallway in the hospital, where the doctor was describing her condition to some other family members. And she knew exactly what the doctor was saying. She heard what her family was saying, and actually later on she recounted that exact conversation to the doctor and to her family, and she recounted it correctly, precisely correctly. So this was a conversation she did not have the ability to hear, even if she was awake and alert, because the conversation didn't happen in close enough proximity for her to have ever heard it. In addition, she was worried about her brother because she knew her brother was concerned. Let me just interject here. The other thing that she, not only could she hear and see what was going on, she could actually feel the emotions of the people that she was perceiving. So she could feel the frustration and the resignation in that doctor. She could feel the sadness in her husband. These emotions came through to her. She perceived that her brother was trying to get there before she died. And so she found herself on the plane with her brother, feeling his emotions and seeing the surroundings in the plane as she was lying there in this bed. She found herself out of her body and in the plane with her brother. Pretty incredible stuff. She ended up just having a knowing. Somebody conveyed to her, it was her father who had already previously passed away. She ended up having a conversation with her father, and her father explained that it was a little bit early for, this is a sort of, again, a typical NDE kind of a story. Her father was explaining it's not your time yet, right? You've got a lot of things to accomplish. And she said she had very, very mixed emotions. Actually, not even that mixed. She did not want to come back. She realized how sick she was and how much of a burden she was to her family. And so she really didn't want to come back from that. Her father persisted, however, and at some point she had this epiphany where, and I don't know whether this was just an understanding that she got somehow or whether her father actually said this, but that she was going to be fine. If she went back into her body, she would recover very, very quickly. She can get on with her life and on with her new life, the new things that she really, should be trying to accomplish. So with that, she decided that she would go back. And so she returned back to her body, came out of the coma, and ended up at that point telling her family what had happened and also telling her family not to worry because she was going to be fine. The doctors were not really believing that. The doctors were believing that she would go back, lapse back into her coma at some point and would die. People don't recover from a sickness as significant as this. But after 3 days, I think she said, all of her tumors had shrunk by 75%. And after 5 weeks, she was perfectly normal. The cancer was completely gone. She had no signs of ever having cancer. And she walked out of the hospital and has never looked back. I'm sure the doctors, for the most part, are thinking that it was a miraculous recovery and that it was their brilliant knowledge of medicine that led to this. And she knows exactly what led to it. It had nothing to do with the medicine. As a matter of fact, there were several procedures and drugs and things like that that they wanted her to take that she refused to take because she knew she was going to recover in any case and that she didn't require their medical attention to do so. I think maybe earlier I was going to say it's a pretty standard part of most of these stories that the person who dies comes up to a barrier, or actually it may be a brook, it may be the edge of a field. There always seems to be a barrier or an edge, and there's typically someone there that they know and trust who is telling them, if you go further, you won't be able to go back, and that it's not your time yet. You should go back. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who had one of these experiences, and I believe it was induced by a reaction to an anesthetic, I think. And he found himself sort of floating upward, and he met his mother, who had died before him, or died before, who had already passed away. And he talked to his mother, and he was floating up to his mother. Apparently he was below her and he's floating up to her. She literally, he tells the story, she put her foot on his head and pushed him down and said, not yet, you're not ready yet. And she pushed him down very, very hard, and literally he felt himself going downward and falling back into his body and eventually waking back up. So that's just another story to share. So that's the Anita Moorjani story. So not only are there the sort of standard NDE kinds of aspects of the story, but there's also the whole miraculous recovery aspect that doctors just say, really was completely, almost unprecedented. The fact that she recovered and the rapidity at which she recovered. All right, so let's tell you another story. There's a psychologist named Kenneth Ring, and he has written several books on near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. And he recounts one of his most famous patients was a woman with the first name Maria. And she was a migrant worker in the Pacific Northwest. And she came down with some sort of heart trouble and had a serious heart attack. And she was rushed unconscious to a hospital in Seattle where she received emergency attention. What she described, and she went through a whole sort of ordeal of dying, being resuscitated, dying and being resuscitated, sort of, the standard sort of cardiac scenario where the doctors are battling to keep the patient alive and the patient keeps sort of dying on them. So she was declared clinically dead at one point. They did bring her back from that state. She found herself floating above her body, and she described the room and the doctors and the scene, etc. But then she found herself floating outside of her window, outside of the building. So she sort of moved through the wall and was looking at the building and the surrounding areas, etc. She floated sort of away from the hospital so she could take in the whole scene. And as she was there, she noticed something a little odd on the fourth floor, I believe on the north side of the building. There was something sitting on the windowsill, just some object. So she moved over to see it. And as people very often describe in these situations, you can kind of move. You move with your thoughts. So if you decide you want to move over to see that object, you will move over to see that object. Turns out it was a tennis sneaker. And it was sitting on the outside of a windowsill. And she noticed it with great detail. I forget what the color is. Let's just say it was red. But she noticed the color, the style, etc. She even noticed that the lace, one of the laces went down and then under the shoe. And so she described the position of the lace to the shoe. So obviously she must have been quite close to this visually to be able to pick up that level of detail. And so, after she had recovered, I don't know whether it was a day or two later, she was describing all these things to her nurses. And the nurses were pretty amazed. And so the nurse went over to her window and looked out on the windowsill and said, "I'm sorry, Maria, but there's no shoe out here. I don't know what you're talking about." She goes, No, I definitely saw it. It was on the fourth floor." And she was like, "Okay, well, we're not on the fourth floor." So they went up and looked, and they didn't see anything on the fourth floor. And she further described which window it was on the fourth floor where they would find this sneaker. Well, after a lot of hullabaloo and a lot of searching, as a matter of fact, it turned out that you couldn't actually see this sneaker very easily from the inside of the building. You really apparently had to work at, getting your head out the window or whatever to be able to actually find this sneaker. But as you might imagine, yes, the sneaker did exist. It was positioned exactly as was described, and the lace was positioned under the shoe exactly as she had described it. Remember, this woman was the first time this woman had ever been to Seattle. So it's not like she drove by this hospital every day and knew that there was a sneaker, on one of the windowsills. Also, when she was brought to the hospital, she was unconscious. She had had a heart attack and was unconscious in the ambulance. So her first bit of consciousness came after she was already in her room, after she had already been getting all these procedures. And this room wasn't positioned in a way to be able to see the sneaker. So there you go. I mean, that's the whole story, the long and the short of it. You can't get more veridical than this. You can't, how evidential do you need a story to be, right? She described a sneaker in a location. She described the color, the location, and the details of this thing. These are things she never could have known about, and are things that the people in the hospital didn't know about. It's not like somehow she had some sixth sense or power to be able to get from one of her nurses that there was this weird sneaker, because none of these nurses that were treating this woman had any clue that there was a sneaker out there, right? This data was that unknown to everybody. This evidence was that unknown. I don't know, sounds pretty convincing to me. All right, so let's get on to the next story. Again, this unit is mostly about stories, just so you can kind of hear some of them. This is the story of Eben Alexander. Eben Alexander is a neurosurgeon in Boston who really had gone through the typical sort of training for a neurosurgeon. So he knows all about brains, all about biology, all about physiology, and is a very successful surgeon. He did not need the revenue from writing a book or the accolade or the attention that you get out of telling a story like this. He's a pretty important, honest, I shouldn't say honest, I don't know if he's honest, a pretty sort of stable, upstanding member of society, right? He's a successful surgeon in Boston, so enough said. My guess is that this is the last thing he would have ever imagined happened. Anyways, what he ended up having was a brain abscess of some sort. He was very, very gravely ill, to the point where he had really essentially no brain function at all at one point. And the doctors had really reached the conclusion that he was simply going to die, and that they would just have to make him as comfortable as they could. And that even if he did live, what they were telling his wife is even if he did live, he would be a vegetable. And he would not have a pleasant life after this was over. So that's what the external story was. The internal story was quite a bit different. Eben Alexander has a whole book on this subject, and I will put a link for the book in my notes. But he described ending up waking up, if you can use that term, waking up in this dark, dirty, dingy, smelly, muddy mess, right? Almost like his face was, almost like he ended up face down at midnight in a mud hole. And literally he was crawling through the mud and crawling through the stench. And it was an incredibly unpleasant experience. He described that in a lot of detail in his book. And eventually, through, and again, I'm not trying to tell the whole story here because there's not enough time, but he ended up sort of elevating himself from that kind of scene into a much lighter, brighter, positive scene. And at one point in the story, he actually ended up, I think the way he described it is riding on the back of a colorful butterfly, flying through the world, flying through, I think, flowers and trees and that sort of thing. Pretty odd, pretty bizarre story, but he ended up sort of having this whole experience. And there was this female with him who seemed to be on the back of the butterfly sharing this experience. Again, there's a ton of detail here that I don't even remember, that I won't even try to recount, but she ended up explaining to him that she was his sister. And he explained to her that he didn't have a sister. And she explained to him that he actually did. But she had died at a very, very young age. As a matter of fact, I want to say it was a miscarriage or something like that. After making a miraculous recovery, which the doctors could not fathom, he ended up being substantially debilitated for a period of time. But over a period of time, he regained his ability to speak, to walk, to communicate, etc. And as far as I know, is back to normal at this point. But what he did, one thing he did in the process, remember, he's a neurosurgeon, and so he's very familiar with the arguments against near-death experiences. He's very familiar with the arguments that brain physiologists have used to argue against some of these kinds of experiences. He's also very familiar with the disease that he had, with the symptoms and the disease that he had. He understands what level of function the brain would have given the seriousness of his condition. So he's really got this kind of unique perspective where he is very, very well suited to diagnose his own, whether or not he should have had the ability to have any kind of an experience. And the way he put it is, and the way his doctors agreed with him, the level of severity of his condition when he was at his worst, when he was about to die, the brain was not able to have higher level function at all. It was barely able to keep his heart beating and to keep him breathing. As a matter of fact, he may have been on artificial respiration at that time. So he and his neurosurgeon associates all agree that his brain was so impaired at that point, it was completely impossible for him to have any kind of a cognitive experience in any way. But what he described, as he describes it, it was more real than real. His level of alertness, his level of awareness, and the distinctness of his experience, the visual nature of the experience, was unlike anything he's ever had in his life, and was more real than real life, is the way he described it. And one thing he also did is, at the time, before this whole thing happened, Eben Alexander knew nothing about near-death experiences. He knew nothing about the symptomology of it. He knew nothing about the kinds of things that one would expect to occur to you during a near-death experience. And so apparently, I think it was his son, who I think was in medical school at the time, I think I've got this right, suggested to his father that his father carefully, meticulously document everything that happened before he spent any time researching near-death experiences. He wanted to make sure that he captured all of his sensations, his feelings, his memories, his description of everything that happened. Do that before you learn anything about what a near-death experience is. Because if you did a bunch of reading about near-death experiences and then wrote down what your experience was, it might be said that your information is clouded by the information that you got from reading about it. So that's exactly what he did. It turns out that he spent, I don't know, some period of time. He had to recover his ability, first of all, to read and write before he could do any of this. But as soon as he did that, he carefully documented his entire experience in great detail. Then he spent a tremendous amount of time investigating near-death experiences. And what he found out was that, yes, in fact, he had had a near-death experience. And many of the things that happened to him were classic things that would happen to a near-death experiencer. He also had a conversation with one of his parents, I believe. I believe he had a conversation with his parents. One way or another, and I don't remember how he did this, he gained access to information that confirmed the fact that, yes, in fact, he did have a sister at one point. And so this woman that he met, and I forget, I think she even told him her name. This woman that he met during this experience who claimed to be his sister. Well, as far as he can determine, was it actually, in fact, his sister, who had died many years previously. So that's the Eben Alexander story. And again, there's a book if you want to read more about it. Tons and tons and tons of factual evidence in there to prove that what occurred actually occurred, and that he gained knowledge that he had no other way of gaining through this process. And as I said, besides the fact that his brain could not have supported high-level thought, but it did. So what does that say? Well, it says a few things. First of all, it says we may not understand the brain as well as we think, but I think more importantly than that high-level thought doesn't originate in the brain. And so I'm going to just pause for a second here and just mention an analogy that I think is important to consider. There's a whole way of looking at the brain. Most scientists look at the brain as, first of all, the seat of consciousness, but it's also the seat of all thought. It's the location for all memories, et cetera, et cetera. Everything that you think, everything you experience, everything you remember, all stems from the brain. That's the sort of typical sort of scientific view of the world. And so people who have studied these, the metaphysics and the spirituality of it, are really saying, no, the brain is not where this stuff originates. The brain is the conduit through which this stuff passes. And there's a big difference. Your memories, your thoughts, your imagination, all of that exists in some non-physical aspect of consciousness, but it's manifested within your body through your brain. So your brain is a conduit. It's not the source of all this. And the analogy that's very often used is a television set. When you sit and watch a TV show, the stuff that you're watching is not originating in the TV set, right? It's being broadcast from somewhere, coming off a videotape or coming out of a camera. It's being broadcast to your TV. Your TV simply represents that information to you, but it is not the source of the information. If you damage the TV, it doesn't change the information. That the TV frequency is still alive, the information is still arriving, but it's not able to be processed by the TV. The analogy even goes further, because there's lots of scientific evidence that says, well, we can go in and we can do brain tomography and with someone playing checkers, and then we can do brain tomography about someone thinking about playing checkers, and it lights up the same aspects of the brain. We can do the same thing with someone dreaming about playing checkers, and it lights up the same area of the brain. And brain scientists will very often say, see, that's proof. That is where the activity happens for you to be able to play checkers. Well, if you follow this TV analogy, you could say, well, gee, when the TV is showing a red apple, if I go in with an oscilloscope and look at the electronics in the TV, I can see the red signal, saying apple, right? The red signal, I can see the signal in the TV that would be needed to display a red apple. And, a technician might say, see, I can prove that this information is actually being created in the TV because I can find the actual transistor where this red information is being processed. But that's totally invalid. The fact is this information is coming from somewhere else. It's being processed by the TV. And yes, in fact, there probably is a circuit that lights up figuratively when a red object is being displayed on the TV. But that doesn't mean that the TV is creating the information. All it means is the TV is responding in some way to the information, right? Eben Alexander discovered that, in fact, what he thought was originating in the brain was not originating in the brain. It was originating somewhere else, and it was passing through the brain. The brain is a conduit. It is not a source of this information, right? That's what he discovered as a neurosurgeon, understanding the original argument and now understanding that the original argument was false, right? So I don't know if he's still a neurosurgeon, but I think he's discovered a lot about the limitations of what the brain actually is. It's certainly an important part of our physiology, but is not necessarily the source of all of our thoughts, our dreams, our memories, etc. All right, so one more story, maybe two more. There's a book and a movie called Heaven is Real. It's about a young boy who ended up becoming very, very, very sick, very, very high fever, and coming very close to death. Actually, some believe he did die, and so we'll just call this an NDE. We'll say he did die, and he ended up, after lots of medical intervention, he ended up being restored to life and recovered. He ended up telling his father a lot of amazing things, and his father was a minister at the local church. But he ended up telling his father that he met his grandfather. And he had never met actually his grandfather because his grandfather died before the child was born. So the child had no information about his grandfather, had never seen a picture of him. The parents apparently had never really discussed his grandfather because that was very ancient information. But the boy talked about his grandfather in a lot of detail about what he looked like and what he said, etc., etc. So the father was, well, on one hand was amazed, on the other hand was shocked. You would think, first of all, he's a very religious man. He's a minister at a church, that somehow these things might confirm his beliefs, but we'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, so the father went and dug out some old picture albums and found a picture of his father and other people, and he showed it to his son and goes, "Is any of these people who you're talking about?" And the son directly pointed, that's Grandpa right there, and of course pointed to his father. So the father was stunned. There's all kinds of other information the boy told the father that ended up being true. And so it was sort of a classic NDE kind of a story where a person dies, meets family, comes back, tells a story, and tells factual information, factual evidence to support his story. But the story actually gets a little bit more interesting than that. The father, being a minister, had a very, very hard time dealing with the fact, because, let me back up. The son also described a lot about what Jesus believes and what Jesus says. And the father took a lot of interest in that because, of course, the father's a minister. So the little boy described, as I remember it, the little boy basically said, gee, people at the church say this and this and this, but that's not what Jesus thinks. Jesus thinks that's wrong. And there are several examples of the little boy explaining how Jesus really felt about certain things. And on one hand, the father was really happy to hear that the boy had gotten it right. And yes, in fact, that is how Jesus would maybe respond to this sort of thing, with love as opposed to hate, etc., etc. But the father ended up having a conversation, I think, with the bishop over this whole thing. And maybe the people who ran the church, because really, in a sense, he worked for those people who run the church. And what he conveyed is the fact that, yes, his son is saying these things, and yes, he believes them, but he's having a real hard time believing that there really is a heaven, which, of course, is the name of the book, Heaven is Real. And I really was shocked at that when I was reading the book. I would think that if anyone would accept this kind of a story from someone, it would be a minister whose whole life is centered around the fact that there really is something called heaven, or a place called heaven, an existence that we call heaven. If anyone would believe that, it would be a minister. It turned out that this minister believed it enough to get up in front of everybody every Sunday and tell people about it and urge them to believe in God and believe in redemption and believe in heaven. He believed it enough to say that every Sunday, but deep, deep down, when it really came down to it, he didn't really believe it at all. And I found it stunning, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people who go to church and who believe in God. If you really gave them a shot of sodium pentothal and really asked them if they believed it, maybe they would tell you that they don't. And as I said, this was the first time I've come face to face with that whole scenario, where you have someone who outwardly believes it. And I'm not saying just outwardly they go to church. I'm saying this is a person who is a minister in a church who didn't actually truly deeply believe that there is a place called heaven. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there is a place called heaven per se. I believe that the human mind is the human thought process is a very interpretive thing. And I think when faced with information, we interpret that information within the context of our own upbringing, our own memories, our own experiences. And so what one person might perceive as heaven, some other person might perceive as nirvana, some other person might perceive as fill in the blank. The evidence that I've been able to garner has shown that people generally are going to perceive things within the context of their experience. That's why some people see Jesus. That's why other people see, Muhammad, et cetera, et cetera. There are interesting cases where people who are atheists, who don't believe in God or religion or Jesus or any of this stuff, will have an experience. And oddly enough, it'll be Jesus who delivers the experience. So there are definitely documented cases where people ended up having an experience that was not directly out of their own what they would expect. It doesn't come out of their own sort of biases. But generally speaking, the biases win. Okay? So that's about the story of heaven is real. So I guess the idea behind all these stories is to give you some examples, very, very evidential examples of near-death experiences. And to me, there is absolutely no doubt, I bet you I've read 100 or more accounts of near-death experiences. And I've been involved directly as an EMT in more than one. And I've been involved in terms of family membership in several others. There is no doubt in my mind as whether this stuff is real and valid. There is no doubt in my mind whether people are telling the truth and conveying what actually happened to them. Again, as usual, are there people out there that are just seeking attention or who just want the excitement of telling a bizarre story? Of course there are. But as I've said in the past, just because you can find an example or two or three or 10 or 100 of people who are making it up, if you can find some examples of people who aren't, well, then that proves that the phenomenon is real. And really, there's no doubt in my mind whether this stuff is real. So to me, another check goes beside another checkbox. Visions and NDE, real stuff. And the nice thing now, if I had said this before you had seen any of these lectures, you might go, yeah, it feels real, but I don't understand how it could be real, right? I don't understand what could allow these things to happen because these things don't comport with scientific theory. Well, that's the reason that we went through all that stuff that we've gone through in the previous units. The previous units were created so that you could understand that scientific theory has proven to be wrong in lots of situations. The double slit experiment, the way vision works, the way senses work, on and on and on. What I've tried to show you is that there absolutely is an underlying non-physical aspect of our reality. And all I'm trying to say now is there's a thing called an NDE. How could an NDE be real? Because there's an underlying non-physical reality. That's what allows NDEs to work, right? You don't need photons to be able to see something. You don't need vibrating air for you to be able to hear things. We've proven that with earlier discussions. We've proven that in dreams. So how can someone have a near-death experience and meet someone and see someone even though their eyes are taped shut? Well, now you know how, all right? So the purpose of building these units up from bottom to top is, I believe what I'm trying to do is every time we have a unit that makes an incredible claim, which we're making here, is that you can see that the underlying mechanisms that need to be in place for that incredible claim to be true, we've already proven. All right? One last thing. Some people claim, some scientists, a lot of skeptics claim, listen, this whole near-death experiences is just lack of oxygen to the brain or strange drugs that people are on because they're in this medical environment and they've got, they've had injections of all these weird drugs to help get them back from death, and all those things are causing hallucinations and other kinds of odd dreams. Well, first of all, it's been proven many, many times that a lot of these near-death experiences, the person was not on strange drugs, was not deprived of oxygen, etc., etc. There's one famous case where a woman was in an aircraft, and the aircraft was actually was getting ready to hit the ground. It was spiraling in, and I think it was a helicopter, and I think it was a military situation. And this person was in perfect health, but spontaneously had a near-death experience because they were near death. They were a few seconds from dying. And they ended up popping out of their body, having the whole classic near-death experience, and then making the decision to go back. And they went back into their body, and that body was now in a crashed aircraft on the ground, right? So that's a case where the person had all the signs and symptoms and experiences of a near-death experience, but was in perfect health. It's just that they were about to die, right? But there's another aspect of this that I wanted to throw out, is that there's a whole other class of experience that shoots a hole in that whole theory. There's something called a shared death experience, an SDE. And that is where caregivers, and this has happened more than once, where a caregiver sitting beside a person who is about to die, or in fact has actually died, actually accompanies the person in the death process, actually accompanies them through the tunnel of light and meeting their relatives and being welcomed into, the afterlife. There have been documented examples where someone has accompanied someone through that process. And in some of those examples, that shared death experience, the person accompanies them through the process, and the person at the other end says, no, it's not your time, and they both end up coming back. And another example that I can think of, this woman was sitting there, I think with her mother, and her mother died. And then in the corner of the room, she goes, it was as if reality ripped open. In the corner of her room, there was it was either a tear or maybe it was some sort of vortex in the room that actually opened up in the room. And her mother both passed through that disturbance and went through the classic tunnel, heading towards the classic light. And when they got all the way to the end, there were people there welcoming the mother into the afterlife. And at that point, I believe what happened was, at that point, they either pushed this woman or she ended up just receding backwards, back down through the tunnel and into her body. All right, that's a shared death experience. Now, that woman had no drugs in her system. That woman had no lack of oxygen in her system, but she experienced the entire experience from beginning to end that her mother went through. She accompanied her mother through that process. So it's just too simple to just chalk it up to lack of oxygen or chalk it up to some strange hallucinogenic drug. That's not what's causing this. All right? So that's all about visitations, visions, NDEs, and shared death experiences. And these are ways that just the average person, without any intervening medium, without any intervening psychic, can have a direct experience of the non-physical. Now, it very often requires dying or coming close to dying to experience this, which is rather unpleasant and rather inconvenient. So most people aren't going to be able to do this just as a test so they can see if they could experience the non-physical. That's the bad news. The good news is there are absolutely things that you can do to have this sort of experience of the non-physical. And we're going to get into that in Unit 9 when we talk about moving behind the veil. So this unit, we were able to see behind the veil. We can look in there, but we can't really go there without dying. We can't even look there without, in some cases, coming close to death. But in the next unit, we're going to talk about how you could actually learn to go there and experience this exact same environment that people who have died experience. So until Unit 9, take care. I'll talk to you then.